Everyone, thanks for joining me. We are going to pick up, for those who might not have been here yesterday, at chapter 1, verse 14. Morty, a couple people are texting me that they don't have sound. Is that something that we can work on or figure out?
Yeah, can folks give me a thumbs up if you can hear? So some people have sound.
Okay.
So you keep going and I'll work on it.
Okay, great. Thanks. So I need a Hebrew reader to take over the task, the thankless task of being interrupted by me. Judith, could I maybe, Judith Cates, pull you into that task? Are you willing to do it? Morty, maybe you can unmute her if she's. I don't see Judith. I shouldn't even assume she's here, but
I'm here.
Oh, okay. Are you? Is that okay? Are you willing to do that?
That's fine. I just have to grab the text from. Take
Okay,
it
great.
from Bill.
Hi, Bill.
Hi. This is great.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to go to verse 14. Okay, great. Whenever you're ready.
ותישאנה קולן ותבכנה עוד, ותשק עורפה לחמותה, ורות דווקא בה.
Okay, great. So they raised their voices and wept more, and then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, whereas Ruth clung to her. Now, I just want to observe that it seems to me that the text makes no negative judgment at all of Orpah. She has been loyal, and now she leaves as Naomi instructs. I say this because some midrashim are extremely harshly critical of her and paint her as somehow who has done something, someone who has done something wrong and even villainous here. Yair Zakovich, who I mentioned yesterday, who's a very kind of literarily astute commentator on the Bible, makes, I think, what is a helpful comment here. He says, it's one thing to shine when you are placed next to a negative character, and it's another thing entirely to shine in juxtaposition to someone who herself behaves quite well. And that's what you have here with Ruth. You don't have, I think, Ruth juxtaposed to a villain, but Ruth juxtaposed to a perfectly reasonable model of how a person behaves. And that's what makes this sort of, if you will, here I'm being a little kind of promiscuous with language, but in a way, Orpah is din and Ruth is lifni mishurat hadin. Orpah does, what's expected, and Ruth does more. And that's the kind of the glorification of Ruth. Okay? Now, I just also want to observe that the root davak is extremely important. Like the modern Hebrew, those who speak modern Hebrew know the word devek for glue. In many instances, especially around Bnei Yisrael's attachment to God, the term suggests, single-minded, exclusive, impassioned attachment. So Ruth's dedication here is seemingly utter, is complete. Okay? Now let's go to verse 15.
ותאמר הנה שבה יבימתך אל עמה ואל אלוהיה, שובי אחרי יבימתך.
Right? So she said, note, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her God. You should do the same. Go follow her. Now, interestingly, the narrator does not explicitly say why Ruth chooses to stay. I mean, one thing that's clear is it is motivated by her love for Naomi, and I think this is important to the narrator, not by her loyalty to her now deceased husband. Nowhere does she mention loyalty. Nowhere does she or the narrator mention loyalty to her deceased husband as what is animating her here. Okay? Now, there is a threefold exhortation, it's worth noticing, to return. In verse 8, in verse 11, and verse 15, we see in each of those cases that Ruth is encouraged, lashuv, to return. I mention this because this is one of the bases for Chazal, for the sages deciding that a prospective convert must be turned away 3 times before being accepted. It is based on the narration of this story. Okay. Now it's also interesting, I think, to notice that Ruth and Naomi speaks of Orpah's gods in a way that suggests that she understands that they are no longer Ruth's gods. People see what I mean by that? Can you give me a nod if you see? In other words, she says, Shava yivimteich el Eloheha. Your sister-in-law has returned to her gods, meaning her gods and not yours, which in some ways anticipates the dramatic scene that is about to unfold. Okay? By the way, Eloheha can mean either her gods or her god. In the case of Moab, they tended to worship one god named Chemosh. That's a topic for another time, and I need to become more qualified to give that shiur. Okay, so now we get to verse 16, which in many ways you could say is the most famous kind of utterance of this book. Go ahead, Judith. Thanks.
ותאמר רות, אל תבכי בי לעוזבך, לשוב מאחרייך, כי אל אשר תלכי אלך, ובאשר תליני אלין, עמך עמי, ואלוהיך אלוהי.
Actually, you know what? Let's read verse 17 too, just because let's keep
ואשר תמותי אמות, ושם אקבר, כה יעשה אדוני לי, וכה יוסיף, כי המוות יפריד ביני ובינך.
Great, thank you. So let's just translate this for a minute. Morty, if you could scroll up just to 16. Thank you. So Ruth said, and Ruth responded, do not encourage me to leave you, to turn my back on you. Rather, where you shall go, I will go. Where you shall sleep at night, I shall sleep. I am not doing this of poetic justice remotely, but your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May God do this and more to me, if anything but death separates me from you. So now, just a couple of observations about this. First of all, al tifkei bi, I think, is a pun, which is quite lovely. It means, on the one hand, as the translation that you have here suggests, do not urge me or encourage me, but can also mean do not insult me or hurt me. Al tifkei bi le'ozveich, don't hurt me by suggesting that I leave you, which is a whole different valence, I think, of what could be meant here. And then the statement that she makes, at the risk of sort of stating the obvious, is that she will share every conceivable aspect of Naomi's life. And she readily acknowledges that that's not going to be a picnic. It sounds like she is embracing the possibility that her life will be fundamentally nomadic. Where you go, I will go. Where you sleep, I will sleep. Does not mean that we'll sleep in the same apartment every night. Right? It means that we're going to bed down wherever we bed down, and I'm with you, and I'm taking that on. Now, I think that the phrase "el asher telchi eleich" is at least meant to conjure up Avraham and Rivka, both of whom are the holchim in the book of Genesis. But what's so striking, and I think this is part of Ruth's heroism, is that you could make the case that for the narrative, her heroism is greater than theirs, because there's no promise of anything on the other side. Avraham is asked for something massive, but he's also promised something massive as a response to it. Ruth is promised nothing. There is no husband waiting for her. There is no wealth. There's no promise of greatness. There's nothing. And thus, in a way, this kind of is a magnification of her own great dedication to Naomi, and arguably even of her chesed. I think, Judith, that's something that you write about in one of your essays on Ruth. So I think that's like really interesting and important. Ruth becomes here a hero. I might have said this yesterday, but I think that you can make a case in Breshit. I think I wrote about this in the Heart of Torah, that the quote unquote fathers of the nation are Avram, Rivka, and Yaakov, based on certain aspects of their behavior. And here Ruth is sort of elevated to that status. And we'll see either today or tomorrow a midrash that's going to kind of note that same idea. Now, also here, just to note, El asher telchi elech uva asher talini alin. This is what in scholarship speak is referred to as a merism. A merism is when you say one thing and its opposite as a way of including everything in between. The example of this I always give students, I'm not really sure why, is asher biado mechkerei aretz v'toafot harimlo. In God's hands are the very depth of the earth and also the very heights of the heaven. Obviously, the meaning of that is not, oh yes, but what's in between is not God's. It's a way of saying this and everything else. I've often said this in this forum. Some modern scholars argue that Eitz Hada'at Tovara, that good and evil, is actually a merism. That it's the tree not of knowing good and evil really, but the tree of knowing everything there is to know. Here, where you go, I will go. Where you lie down, I will lie down, is a way of saying I'm with you completely and totally. Okay. One thing that some modern scholars say that I'm curious, people feel free to sort of share your thoughts as you hear this. One thing I think is interesting is that modern scholars often suggest that her embrace of Naomi's God is a function of her embrace of Naomi and not a function of her embrace of Naomi's God. That was barely an English sentence, but I hope you understand what I mean. In other words, she's embracing Naomi's God because it's Naomi's. This is not, despite certain midrashic images here, necessarily a religiously motivated conversion. It's a statement of loyalty to Naomi. Now, one thing I also did want to mention here is that most translations translate Amech Ami Velohaich Elohai as your people shall be my people and your God shall be my God. Ellen Davis actually suggests that we should actually translate your people is my people, your God is my God, as if to declare this is already true. They already share these two things, a people and a God, and therefore that becomes the basis of sharing all the contingencies of the near future and the far future. So I think that that's interesting as a possibility. Okay. Elohaich, to go back to what I said on the previous verse, can be translated as the singular or the plural. Does Ruth know that in Israel she may only worship one God? The next verse would seem to suggest that she does, as we'll see in just a second. Okay. Now, this is something Judy Fentress Williams makes the observation here that I think is quite lovely, that this is an example of performative speech. Those of you familiar with J.L. Austin's famous article about performative speech, that is speech that calls into being something that is not. After this declaration, there is a relationship that exists between these two people that has not existed before. It is performative speech. Now, just a couple of quick things.
Can you marry me?
On verse 17. Make sure everyone, if you could mute yourself, that would be great. Ko yaseh Hashem li v'cho yosif. I wanted to just notice something theological that's really striking here, and maybe cuts against what I said on the last verse. This phrase is most associated, I think, with Jezebel, with Izebel, in 1 Kings chapter 19, when she threatens Eliyahu. Ko yasun Elohim v'cho yosifun. I'm doing this by heart. I hope I get this right. Ki chait machar asim et nafshecha kenefesh achad mehem. Tomorrow, so may the gods do to me, and more, if I don't kill you like you killed the prophets of Baal. I think what is striking here is that Ruth does not use the language of Jezebel. Ko yasun Elohim, so may the gods do. It's clear that is what Jezebel means, I think. But rather, she uses the name, the Shem HaMeforash, Yud Hey Vav Hey. She meant what she said to Naomi about accepting her God in the last verse, right? Okay, so that I think is actually quite important. Also, this oath formula, if I'm not mistaken, is used elsewhere in Tanakh only by a king or a leader of the people. And it is possible then that when Ruth says this, she unconsciously, presumably, is kind of intimating that she will end up being the mother of kings, that there is some kind of anticipation here of the unfolding of the plot. This is a good example of how, the challenge of really learning Tanakh is that you have to know all of Tanakh before you can start learning it. It's kind of like the challenge of learning the Talmud or any kind of corpus of literature that alludes to itself all the time. That would be very hard to notice, I think, it's not something, to be honest, that I noticed until I read certain people commenting on it. Okay? Now, just to understand the language here, Ko yaseh Hashem li v'cho yosif, so may God do to me and more, but what God may do to me is never specified. It's almost if the consequences are too horrific to imagine, right? That's the kind of oath. What would happen to me is unfathomable if I don't do this. Ki hamavet yafrid beini uveinech, because she may be saying that only death will separate between them, or saying not even death will separate between them. Given her commitment to be buried with Naomi, it seems like the latter is probably the case. Not even death, right, will separate them. That's a little different than the JPS translation. My daughter Maya, I don't know if she's on this call, but my daughter Maya observed to me when we were discussing this verse a week ago or so, that this formulation troubles her, because to say to someone who has just buried everyone dear to them, only death will separate between us. There are more sensitive ways to speak to a person who has just endured such immense loss, because you could imagine her saying, yes, as a matter of fact, death will separate between us. Death separates between me and everyone I care about. Okay. Now, how should we interpret Naomi's silence? And let's actually read verse 20. Verse 18, if you don't mind, Judith.
ותרא כי מתאמצת היא ללכת איתה, ותחדל לדבר אליה.
Right, so when Naomi saw that Ruth was utterly determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. And the interesting question, I think, is how to understand Naomi's silence. Here are some possibilities. I think there are a lot. One is that she's amazed at Ruth's selflessness and dedication. Another is that she's so emotionally withdrawn, she just wants this person to go away. Another is that she's scared, feeling burdened by being responsible for this probably somewhat young woman who has a long life ahead of her, and Naomi lacking the means to care for her. Here, if I may quote Judith Cates, who's reading for us, she's so desolate that she cannot even acknowledge Ruth's oath of loyalty. That, I think, is a major trope psychologically in this book. The ways that devastation makes certain kinds of human receptivity impossible. That's my language. I don't want to put that on Judith, but that's my language. The receptivity disappears in the midst of the suffering. Murray Gow, contemporary Bible scholar, talks about the reason she can't speak is clinical depression. She's just totally unable to even begin to talk. She's sunk inside herself. Another interesting possibility that Tamar Eskenazi mentions is that she can't answer because conversion and integration of the kind that Ruth is alluding to would require communal affirmation, and she doesn't have the right to give it. I still would go with number 4 if I could, which is she's so desolate she can't even acknowledge it. But nevertheless, several of these might not be mutually exclusive, as we've talked about before. I guess I want to mention, even though I find this quite unpersuasive, that some people, modern scholars, want to see Naomi as resentful of Ruth, perhaps blaming her for the death of her son. It just seems to me that it's important to note, as we're going to see, hopefully beginning today and then more tomorrow, that the only way Boaz and others could have known of Ruth's chesed is actually if Naomi found ways to tell them. And given, by the way, that also Ruth and Orpah are so utterly committed to clinging to her, it seems odd to imagine that Naomi's posture towards them is resentment and disinterest. So I just don't buy that possibility, but want to mention that it exists out there as an interpretation. Okay, let's do 19.
ותלכנה שתיהם עד בואנה בית לחם, ויהי כבואנה בית לחם, ותהום כל העיר עליהן, ותאמרנה הזאת נעמי.
Okay, so the two of them continued until they arrived at Bethlehem. And when they arrived at Bethlehem, the whole city was abuzz over them. And the women said, could this be Naomi? So one thing I want to just notice here is that the phrase "vatelachna shtehem," if you are hearing Breshit in your mind, you might expect that the next word would be yachdav. Vayilchu shnehem yachdav. I'm referring to Avraham and Yitzchak. You don't have that here. So I think that raises perhaps the question of whether they are together or alone, or in what ways they are together or alone, and that again raises the issue of Naomi's ability or inability to receive the full presence of Ruth, etc. Okay. Fentress Williams reads this very differently and suggests that the word shtehem, the mention of the number 2, reminds the reader of all those who have not returned, either by choice, Orpah, or without choice, Elimelech, Machlon, and Kilion. In other words, the 2 of them returned of the many that could have or should have returned. Now, it's interesting to note, Vatomarna Hazot Naomi, it's almost like Ruth totally disappears in this scene. Now, Ellen Davis here suggests, and I thought this was interesting, that Naomi actually tries to draw attention to herself because she wants to protect Ruth from attention that could easily be hostile. She's a Moabite, better to have the attention focused on me. Of course, we don't know that Naomi did anything to elicit this reaction. Hazot Naomi, I guess, suggests either they are surprised she has returned, they are surprised she has returned without her whole family, or they are commenting on how different she looks, since after all, she has been through an awful lot. Okay? Also, hazot, the phrase hazot begins questions about something that has changed dramatically. I think here, for example, of Eicha Perek Bet, Lamentations chapter 2, Hazot ha'ir sheyomru klilat yofi misos kol haaretz. Could this be the city that was seen as the paradigm of beauty, the joy of all the earth, right? So Hazot is like, so that actually leads me to suspect that what they're really saying here is, look at her. She looks like 1,000,000 years have passed, but only 10 have passed. Something like that, that her suffering has changed her visage and like the way she presents herself. Okay, so let's read Pasuk 20, Chaf.
ותאמר עליהן, אל תקראנה לי נעמי, קראנה לי מרה, כי המר שדי לי מאוד.
Okay, so she says, do not call me Naomi, right? Call me Mara, for Shaddai, we're going to emphasize that name in a minute, has made my my situation extremely bitter. Okay. Now, what's interesting, I think, to notice is that in general, someone could correct me if I'm wrong about this point, but I think this is true. I haven't researched this, but I think that in general, the changing of a name in Tanakh is usually a function of blessing and new possibilities. Think of like Avram becoming Avraham, Sarai becoming Sarah, etc. Yaakov becoming Yisrael. Here, it's really striking that this takes that idea and turns it on its head. That is to say, right, she goes from pleasantness to bitterness. It's about a constriction or contraction of her universe. And And then again, she blames God, I think quite forcefully. And this goes to, Judith mentioned yesterday Lois Dubin's essay about connecting to Job. Here, I think I think it's clear. I mean, I'm hesitant to say that, but like Job, she doesn't think she deserves such treatment. But unlike Job, she doesn't protest to God directly, but instead complains to the other women about how God has treated her. Yair Zakovich, in his commentary on the book of Ruth, simply refers to her as the female Job, much like Lois Dubin. Now, the use of the word Shaddai as a name of God here is just excruciating, I think, because Shaddai is a name that is associated with fertility. You can look at Genesis 49, for example. And these is the association of a name of God that is associated with fertility, or sorry, the invocation of that name by Naomi almost feels like sarcasm to me. And if it's not sarcasm, it's at least utter devastation, right? The God of fertility has done a number on me. And it's like, you can choke on those words because she's obviously lost the fruit of her womb. Okay, Pasuk Chaf Aleph.
Ani mele'a alachti, v'reikam heshivani Adonai. Lama tikrena li Naomi, v'Adonai anavi, v'Shaddai hera li.
Okay, so she says, I went away full, and the Lord has returned me empty. Why would you call me, Naomi, pleasantness, when God has, JPS translates, dealt harshly with me. I'll comment on that in a second. V'Shaddai heirali, and God has brought misfortune upon me. So anavi would literally mean testified against me, witnessed against me. And of course, in what Naomi never does not know and never finds out is what it is that God has accused her of, right? And on that level, she really does resemble Job, who also doesn't have any understanding of why he's being put through what he's put through. Now, JPS, if I'm not mistaken, is translating anavi as if it said inavi, that is to say, dealt harshly with me, laid me low, oppressed me, something like that. The JPS is based on the only way I can make sense of the JPS is based on a revocalization. If God has oppressed me, and the word inui there would be a very strong accusation. Think about that's a word that describes how the Egyptians treated the Israelites. So to accuse God of inui is a very fierce criticism. Okay. Now, returning empty. On the one hand, that's accurate. She is without all of the things that protect a woman in a patriarchal society. No father, no husband, no son. She's really quite vulnerable. But the thing that I wonder about is whether her saying Rekam is supposed to draw our attention again to how she still can't really accept or understand that with Ruth with her, she is not totally empty. Right? That there's something going on there that's an evocation of her psychological state and not just a description of her actual situation. What Eskenazi says in her JPS commentary on Ruth that I think is at least worth noting is that the book of Ruth exposes the social vulnerability of a woman without men to protect her and undercuts it at the same time. Remember that the women will say to her in chapter 4, the love of Ruth. What is it? The love of Ruth is as good for you as as 7. What is it? 7 sons? Am I remembering that? Quoting that verse right? Yeah. Okay. So that's an undercutting of that social vulnerability. That's a kind of like a refusal of the patriarchal values in some sense, or subversion of the patriarchal values. Okay. Okay. And then, okay, let's read verse 22.
Vatashov Naomi v'Ruth haMoaviyah chalata ima השבה משדה מואב, והמה באו בית לחם בתחילת קציר שעורים.
Okay, so Naomi returned from the country of Moab with her daughter-in-law, Ruth, the Moabite. We'll talk about that in a second. And they came to Beit Lechem at the beginning of the barley harvest. One of the reasons why I was suggesting that one way to understand Naomi's comment of I came back empty is that description of her psychological state that is not fully accurate in its perception is look how the narrator then responds. She says, I came back empty. And what does the narrator then says? Vatashov Naomi Veruth Moaviyah ima. And someone was with her. She didn't come back totally empty. She came back with someone. Now, here, I suspect the reason why we hear Ruth described as Hamoaviyah is because the narrator wants to suggest the serious obstacles Ruth faces in wanting or trying to become integrated in Israelite society. She is, after all, a Moabite. She is now an outsider. In a funny way, she's more of an outsider now that she's arrived in the land than she was when they were wandering in between the lands. Maybe not even in a funny way, in an obvious and clear way. Okay? Now, Hamoaviyah Kalata, Zakovich makes the nice observation, the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, that the pairing is a way of emphasizing the contrast between her foreignness and her connection to the land through Naomi, right? And so the question will become, which of these identities will end up carrying the day? Is she fundamentally an outsider who won't fit? Or is she fundamentally a daughter-in-law who will fit? Okay, now, just to be pedantic for a minute, I think it would not be crazy to imagine that the words ima and hashava should be reversed, such that the pasuk would have read Vatashov Naomi Veruth Moaviyah Chalata Hashava ima misde Moav, which I think actually flows much better, but you can do that as you will. When they left famine, and when they return, barley harvest. And I think that this is a somewhat in-our-face symbol, if you will, that the characters are going to undergo a journey from emptiness to fullness. The harvest, of course, is the symbol of new possibility, fertility, etc. Okay? So right after Naomi complains that she has returned empty, we learn first that Ruth is with her, and second of all, that Ruth is with her just as the barley harvest begins. So her emptiness is not quite as complete as she would imagine that it is. So for the moment, at least, I think loss and hope subsist side by side, right? There is the incredible devastation on the one hand, and then there is the hope of Ruth accompanying her, as well as the barley harvest beginning. Okay. I'm going to just keep going into chapter 2, and then I will stop again at 6 to take questions. So let's turn to chapter 2. Okay. Judith, are you fine to keep reading? Is that okay?
Yes, it's fine.
Great. So let's just dive right in.
ולנעמי מודה לאישה, איש גיבור חיל ממשפחת אלימלך, ושמו בועז.
Okay, so Naomi had a relative, someone close to her, maybe we could translate, on her husband's side, a man of wealth or character. I think we could translate Gibor Chayil in either way, from the family of Elimelech, his name was Boaz. Now, interestingly, one of the things that this all of a sudden suggests is that Naomi had access to resources that we have not been told about and that she has not mentioned until now. And it also perhaps underscores how isolated they are. None of these people who might be related to her have reached out to her at all. And here you again wonder whether this is people treating tragedy as a contagious illness, or whether it's about the fact that she's returned with a Moabite. Whatever it is, we hear this, I think we get this double-edged insight from this pasuk. A, there are people she could turn to, and B, those people have done nothing to reach out to her. Now, one thing I think is worth asking here is the reader, are we as readers supposed to understand what's about to unfold as providential or as chance? And we'll talk about that as we go. Okay. It's almost like you could translate this verse as, it just so happened that Naomi had, etc. And it just so happened is always an interesting kind of phrase. Davis, again, Ellen Davis plays with the tenses and wants to translate this verse. Now Naomi has a kinsman on her husband's side, and sees this as if the narrator had turned to address the reader directly. She has a kinsman, and so now the story is going to get interesting. Okay, moda, or miyuda, as the ktiv is from the root yud dalet ayin, to know, probably means a relative, could mean a friend or a relative, but in context here becomes clear that it's a relative. We never learn, for whatever it's worth, precisely how he's related to Elimelech. Chazal, the sages, try to fill that in. Boaz is Elimelech's nephew and Naomi's cousin, but we'll leave that. Now, Gibor Chayil, originally in earlier biblical texts, Gibor Chayil is a military man, but I think that over time it comes to mean a person of wealth, or a person of social status. It is a parallel term to Eshet Chayil, which Boaz will use to describe Ruth in chapter 3. Ellen Davis argues, I don't know exactly based on what, that Gibor Chayil doesn't just mean wealth and status, but also is an estimation of a person's moral character. I have to research that and think about that more. Anyone who has thought about that, all of the various Tanakh teachers on this call, if you have thoughts on that, feel free to weigh in on that. Okay. The meaning of Boaz is less than clear. Perhaps already suggested in Rabbi, it means boaz, there is strength in him, which would make sense to go with Gibor Chayil, but not totally sure. Some kind of perhaps homiletical, I'm not really sure, readers want to connect the name Boaz to the fact that one of the pillars of the temple is called Boaz, Yachinu Boaz, or the pillars of the temple, which may be a way of bringing God's presence into this, like another hint of God's presence. I'm not quite sure that that's pshat, but it's interesting. Okay, pasuk bet. We're flying here.
Vatomer Ruth HaMoaviyah el Naomi el Chana Hasadeh va'alakata v'shibolim achar asher emtzachen be'enav vatomer la lechi biti.
Great. So Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, I would like to go. May I please go to the field to glean among the ears of grain behind someone who will show favor to me? And Naomi answered, go, my daughter. Now here, I just want to mention something here about Hesed. And rabbis on this call, here's a drasha for Shavuot. I see Paul Kerbel smiling. Ruth, what is so interesting here is that Ruth asks for permission to go from Naomi, as if Naomi would be doing her a favor by letting her go, as opposed to Ruth being the one who's doing a favor to Naomi by going. And what I love about this is the ways in which this is just powerful idea about real authentic chesed does not call attention to itself. You know, you've met people in your life who do a mitzvah and call a press conference, right? Ruth is the opposite of that, right? It's like, let me couch this in the most self-effacing way so that even though I'm doing something for you, I'm giving you the feeling that you're doing something for me so that you feel like you're capable of giving, given how desolate and destroyed you feel. I just think this is such an exquisite interpersonal moment that it's worth kind of dilating. It's really worth focusing on. Now, Interestingly, Ruth wants to go alone, and Malbim, one of the great modern rabbinic commentators, points out that it seems like her goal is to shield her mother-in-law, who was once wealthy, from the sheer humiliation of now becoming a gleaner. So not only is it the chesed of asking for permission to go, it's the chesed of saying, I'm going to go. Obviously, you're not going. Okay? Now, when we talked about how in the first chapter, the root lashuv, to return, is so fundamental, in this chapter, lamed kuf tet, lakat, is the controlling term in this chapter. It appears 12 times in this chapter. Exactly what it means, I'm not 100% sure, other than perhaps thinking about how in Vayikra, the emphasis of this word on caring for and responsibility for those who are poor. Okay, now another observation about this, she says, I want to glean among the ears of corn behind someone who shows me favor. Now, what's interesting is that technically that's a legal requirement. She shouldn't have to depend on someone who shows her favor. Perhaps that means that the law was not enforced, leading some to flout it. Perhaps it's actually about what she wants. She doesn't want to walk behind someone who's just law-abiding. She wants to walk behind someone who's loving and kind, which is a really kind of an interesting understanding of what Ruth is hungry for in this moment. She doesn't claim her rights, in other words, but rather asks for kindness. The phrase emtzachein, worth noting, is used usually when a speaker wants to get goodwill from someone who has power over them. Think about the Egyptians with Yosef in Genesis 47, Moshe with God in Exodus 33. So I think that that's interesting and important. Now, those who want to argue that Naomi is ambivalent about Ruth will say here, how could Naomi not tell Ruth about her wealthy relative? And why would she not warn her, as she will later, about the dangers that come to a woman who is out gleaning by herself? They want to say that that's a function of her ambivalence. Again, I wonder whether this is a sign that she's just utterly consumed with her own grief and can't even bring herself to care for the other person in the way she ought to. Not sure, but I think that that's the way perhaps she ought to, okay? Another interesting thing, this time Ruth sends her out. I'm borrowing this phrase from Judy Fentress Williams. She sends Naomi out, but not away this time. Lechibiti, go, my daughter. But she's not sending her away. She's consenting to her being part of her world, which is a kind of progression in the relationship between them. I also think it's probably significant that she refers to her as my daughter. We see here the way that Ruth's kindness begins in small ways to awaken the kindness that Naomi is capable of, but is submerged under her grief. Right? One of the things I think is so interesting in this book is the way that Chesed awakens Chesed. It reminds me, Rav Yitzchak Hutner, one of the great 20th century darshanim, in the Pachad Yitzchak, in the beginning of his volume on Rosh Hashanah, talks about how if Chesed is functioning healthily, every time a person does a Chesed, they plant a seed of Chesed in the person they do it towards. And in a healthy environment, that Chesed, he says, cannot but flower into another act of Chesed. So there's some way in which you see here Ruth's Chesed almost brings, the African-American feminist writer Beverly Williams talks about how one of the great things human beings deny is that we can kill or destroy each other with our words, something like that. I'm misquoting her, but it's something like that. This is a really interesting example that I think Ruth is in a way almost resurrecting Naomi in this act of kindness. Okay, Pasuk Gimel. We're flying, Judith. I'm telling you, we're flying.
ותלך ותבוא ותלקט בשדה אחרי הקוצרים, ויקר מקרה חלקת השדה לבועז אשר ממשפחת אלימלך.
Okay, GPS rather colloquially, and off she went. She came and she gleaned in a field behind reapers, And then how do we want to translate Vayiker Mikre? Probably literally as chance would have it, something like that. The field that she ended up in was Boaz's field, the one who was from Elimelech's family. Now, if we had lots of time and I weren't already so far behind, I would invite you to look up a few instances in Tanakh where we have the phrase Vayiker Mikre. In some places, I'll say this slowly in case people want to write this down to look it up, as in Genesis 24:12 and Genesis 27:20, it clearly suggests the hand of divine providence being involved. But in other places, like in 1 Samuel 6:9, it seems to suggest the opposite of providence, but rather chance. I wonder, as always, this is almost a bit of a tick for me, so you take it as you will, but I wonder whether that ambiguity is intentional. That is to say, the reader is kind of almost left to decide what to see here. Many traditional interpreters, not surprisingly, find God's hand here, as in Esther. In some ways, it becomes quite parallel. And I think that they're based on Genesis 24. That's a pretty plausible reading. But again, I wonder whether the ambiguity is intentional. The universe is actually sometimes hard to figure out. What is happening? Is it God or is it not God? Okay. Zakovich tries to split the difference and in an interesting way says only hinting at God's involvement is what allows the human characters to fully blossom and achieve their full stature. The narrator wants to focus not on God's providence, but on their chesed. That's a way of, as it were, splitting the difference of having both. I mean that totally not pejoratively. If that's a pejorative phrase, I'm not sure it is. So, okay, Pasuk Daled. Let's go on.
והנה בועז בא מבית לחם, ויאמר לקוצרים, אדוני עמכם, ויאמרו לו, יברכך אדוני.
Okay, vihine is what literary scholars call a focalizer. That is, we're supposed to see from the like within the eyes of the characters. Look or behold, here comes Boaz. Now, Fentress Williams makes this really interesting comment that I had not really thought about before. That I thought really was like a chiddush to me. Was a really an insight. Is that why are we told that Boaz is coming from Beit Lechem? Because that's what will make sense of the fact that he's heard about all the kindness that she's done to Naomi. In other words, how does he know when he says, yeah, Hagedu godly, it's been told to me, I surely know all the kindness that you've done. Oh, Boaz was coming from Bethlehem where Naomi lives. And that kind of explains what's going to unfold between them. I thought that was interesting. Now, remember what I mentioned yesterday that Robert Alter, again, I'm not sure this is his original insight, but he is very focused on this, that the first thing a character says often tells us about their character. And here we have a man who is A, focused on God, Hashem imachem, and B, incredibly generous and open-hearted and benevolent towards his workers, right? A man who walks in and greets his workers and says, Hashem imachem, and they say, and they respond immediately, Varechecha Hashem. Okay? Pasuk Hey.
ויאמר בועז לנערו, הנצב על הקוצרים, למי הנערה הזאת?
So Boaz said to his young servant who was in charge of the reapers, to whom does this young woman belong? Or to whom does this girl belong? Maybe we should translate Na'ara. Now, one thing that perhaps we're supposed to learn from this quite subtly is that he's a man of significant means. That is to say, he has a workforce with, tiers of stature and seniority. He has, a guy who's the boss. Whose girl is that? It's just interesting to note that the narrator doesn't tell us what it is about Ruth that catches Boaz's eye. Ibn Ezra seems to think it's because she's beautiful, but the text really doesn't say that, and I'm not sure we're supposed to think that. maybe we're just supposed to think Boaz has given us the impression already of taking interest in and caring for his workers. So he immediately notices that there is a young woman present who doesn't belong there, who's not usually there. And there is, of course, a certain irony because he says, whose girl is that? And the girl will, forgive please the patriarchal assumptions here, the girl will soon be his. One thing that's worth saying here is the fact that the servant knows who she is makes me wonder whether we're supposed to assume that she, Dafka, kind of goes out of her way to ask for permission, right? Which would fit with what she said earlier on. Like, I know I may be legally obligated, but that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in someone who's going to show me kindness. So she goes to the superintendent and basically says, can I glean here? Okay, which would explain exactly how he knows who she might be. Okay, so let's go to, by the way, this also is perhaps reminiscent of Abraham's story, Abraham's servant at the well asking to whom belongs the woman that he spies for Yitzchak. Okay, so now let's go to Pasuk Vav.
ויען הנער הניצב על הקוצרים, ויאמר נערה מואביה היא, השבה עם נעמי משדה מואב.
So I just want to here underscore the double repetition of Ruth's status as a Moabite. She is a Moabite girl who has come back from Moab. That I think is interesting. And there's also no mention of kalata here, the way there had been before. I'm not really sure what that means. Zakovich thinks that that's a way of acknowledging that what animated her was not the fact that she was a daughter-in-law, but the fact that she was moved by a spirit of chesed and love. Whether we should read that into words attributed to the superintendent of the field, I'm not totally sure. That might be a bit of an overread. Okay, Pasuk Zayin.
ותאמר הלקת נא ואספתי ואמורים אחרי הקוצרים, ותבוא ותעמוד מאז הבוקר ועד עתה, זה שבטה הבית מעט.
Right, so now he's going to report what she says. She came and said, please let me glean. So this is what I was saying a minute ago, is what we're supposed to assume happens. And then we find out that, in fact, it did. Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers. She has been standing since the morning until now. And then shivta can mean a lot of different things. She has sat but little. She had rested but little. She has returned home but little. But in other words, she's been working, diligently and industriously. Now, Ruth working hard means she has seemingly gained the respect of this guy. Seems to suggest that he, respects her. And again, why does she ask for permission to do what the law permits her to? Perhaps some landowners don't obey the law. Perhaps she dafka specifically wants someone who does chesed, or perhaps ba'omarim means literally among the sheaves, meaning that she wants to glean among the grain that has already been bundled, which would go beyond what the law requires, which is about what's dropped or not bundled. That assumes that ba'omarim means the same thing as bein ha'omarim in Pasuk Tet Vav coming up. Now, another possibility Tikva Feimer-Kensky mentioned, she asks to go behind the workers, right behind the reapers, so that she gets first pickings. For that, she needs permission. Okay, so there's a lot of possibilities here. I'll just mention here just because it's fun from the Hebrew perspective. Shivta can come from the root shavat, meaning she has rested but little, from the root lashav, shin vav bet, which would mean she has returned home but little, or from the root yud shin bet, meaning she has sat down but little. But in any case, all three of those would mean the same thing, which is she's highly diligent. She hasn't rested for a second. Perhaps she's sitting down when Boaz arrives, which is what prompts his question. And this is how he answers. Oh, don't be misled. She's sitting here, but she hasn't sat at all day long. Okay, Pasuk Chet.
ויאמר בועז אל רות, Alo shamat biti al תלכי ללקוט בשדה אחר, וגם לא תעבורי מזה, וכה תדבקין עם נערותיי.
So Boaz said to Ruth, listen to me. Don't go glean in another field, in a different field, and don't go elsewhere, or perhaps gamlo ta'avuri mizeh, do not go against what I'm saying. It's also possible. V'cho tidbakinim na'arotai, stay here close to my girls. Okay, now it's worth noting that in the structure of this chapter, the dialogue between Boaz and Ruth is at the center. The chapter begins and ends with a dialogue between Ruth and Naomi. The second and fourth parts are dialogues between Boaz and his workers. And then the middle part is this dialogue between Boaz and Ruth, which forms the middle, the chapter, the center of the narrative.
Wow.
Halo shamat, which I translated a minute ago as listen to me. Ellen Davis suggests that we read Halo shamat more literally as haven't you heard? Meaning that he expected Ruth to have heard of instructions he had already given his workers about how they were to treat her, that he had heard about her. I'm not sure that's right, but I think it's at least interesting. Now, Boaz refers to her as BT, which is also, as Fentress Williams notes, potentially performative. He creates a new reality with him as her protector. He had asked whose she was, and now, in a sense, he already makes her his responsibility. Now, the question I think as a reader we're supposed to be asking already is, why does Boaz want Ruth to stay close? Is he protecting her, or is he already drawn to her and interested in her in some way? As I mentioned, v'gam lo ta'avuri mizeh could mean don't go elsewhere, but in which case it's a kind of poetic flourish that he says the same thing twice. Or it could mean do not transgress against this directive, or do not disobey what I'm saying to you. And then just worth noting that the Ruth tidbakin, we've already talked about that. Ruth had stuck with Naomi. That was verse 14 of chapter 1. Now she is instructed to stick with Boaz's girls. It's almost like the chesed she puts into the world is coming back to her now. There's a way in which there's a kind of almost a karmic effect of chesed, I think. Right? She stuck to Naomi, and now she's instructed, just stick to my girls and you'll be taken care of. Being among Boaz's girls is like being promoted. She's not just a gleaner, I think. She's like among the workers, which presumably would mean she gets a better pick. I think it would mean that. Okay, let's just read one more verse to end Boaz's comment. And then we'll pause. Einayich basadeh, go ahead.
Einayich basadeh asher yiksorun v'halacht achareihen. Halo tziviti et hane'arim levilti nog'ech. V'tzamit v'halacht el hakelim v'shatit me'asher yishavun hane'arim.
Right, so keep your eyes on the field that they are reaping and walk after them. I have already commanded them not to bother you. Not to, I'll talk about that in a minute. And if you grow thirsty, go to the jars and drink from the water that the men have drawn from the well. Okay, so now just a couple of things. First, Boaz seems to want to protect her obviously by keeping her away from the men. Linnog eich, I just want to point out, the recent JPS translates molest you, and I translated it somewhat more loosely as bother you, is that word can suggest a fear of sexual attack. You can look at Genesis 20, where Avimelech is kind of implicitly it threatens Sarah. So there's the way I have warned them not to assault you, something like that. But it's also really interesting, the gender reversal here. Here, the outsider is given water. Sorry, the outsider who is given water, I can't speak English all of a sudden. The outsider who is given water and a warm welcome is a woman drinking from what men have pulled from the well. CF, Rebecca, Rachel and Yaakov, Moshe and Yitro's daughter. There's something really gendered here that's quite interesting. And in light of Deuteronomy 23:5, where Moabites do not share water with Israel, the fact that here we have, as I mentioned yesterday, an Israelite sharing his water with this Moabite woman is, I think, supposed to be some kind of repair, some kind of, a better, okay. Okay. Let me stop here and take a couple questions. Tomorrow we will resume with verse 10. Morty, do you want to call on people?
Yes, if you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand. You can do that by clicking on the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and clicking raise hand. Okay, I see Annette. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we hear you.
Oh, okay. My question is two things. One, when it said "Velo ta'avri," ta'avori is. Can you see it just the above the last paragraph you showed?
I'm sorry, I was not able to make
it mean? It says ta'avori. Could it be that it means avur, that she can't hear you?
Annette, we're having trouble hearing you. Can you try one more time?
Or why don't you type your question into the chat box, and I'll take another question first, and then I'll go to your question, okay? Because we're not hearing you well.
Great.
My apologies for that.
Shlomo Cohen, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
I have a question which is not directly text related. But my wondering is, we have 5 books in the Tanakh called Megillah. Why isn't this called a Sefer? What is it about these books that make them different than Sfarim? That's one question that I had. The second question I have is about the text we're reading. And that is, what's the relationship at this point between the children of Israel and the Moabites? Because this suggests to me that there might be some degree of intermarriage going on. And this is a treatise to the community. It's not that bad that there's some intermarriage going on with the Moabites.
Okay, so to your first question, I'm going to answer it kind of at a funny angle, which I'm not sure is really an answer. What I have been thinking about a lot in the last year is that what the Megillot all share in common is a preoccupation with the presence and absence of God in a way that is distinct and continuous. Think about Esther. Is God there or is God not there? Shir HaShirim, is God mentioned or is God not mentioned? Is there any possibility that the allegory is pshat, or is it only, right, a quote unquote, a secular story? Ruth, as we're going to see, what are the ways that divine providence works? Eicha, God, what planet are you on? How could you do this? Are you here? Are you not here? Are you an abuser? Etc. Etc. And right. So in other words, what I find really interesting is the Megillot as a unit, as a kind of set of meditations on the presence and absence of God in a world that is very different than the world of, say, Sefer Shemot, where you have a kind of thunderous divine intervention. So I don't know that I know how to answer your question the way you asked it, but what I find interesting is that these 5 books share a designation and that there's something extremely significant about that. Your second question, You know, there are people who see the book of Ruth as a kind of critique of the ideology of Ezra and Nehemiah. That is to say, keep the outsider out at all costs, take the outsider who's already penetrated inside and push them outside. It's a polemic against Ezra and Nehemiah. I don't dispute that reading. I just always want to point out that reading texts as polemics always runs the risk of eliminating their sheer literary and theological richness. So I would say it may also be a polemic, but we should avoid the temptation to read it as only a polemic, because I think it's also a meditation on love and a meditation on the way Hesed works and what faithfulness looks like and what it means to enact God's presence in the world through our own acts of love. So just to be clear, I just want to avoid the reduction of the book to polemic, but I'm totally open to the possibility that may be also polemic. I hope that that's clear.
Rabbi, I'm going to call on Rabbi Kerbel.
Shai, great study sessions. I'm curious, my Persian congregants in Roslyn, Long Island, when they were called to the Torah, which would say Hashem imachem, and we would respond Yevarechecha Adonai. That's their custom. So I'm just wondering, does this appear in other places in the Tanakh, or is this unique here to?
I think this is based on here. This is where this comes from.
Okay, I wasn't sure if it appeared.
There are people on this call who have Bikiyut and Tanakh more than I do. Rachel Weinstein, if you're on this call, you can tell me if there are other places. But I think this is the source.
Okay. Yeah, it's a beautiful.
I can check that to be sure, but that is my impression. So we didn't get at the end. The question did not come into the chat box. Am I right about that, Morty? Okay. Any other questions before we? I'm amazed by this. Okay. Oh wait. Shlomo. I think you already got. Barbara Chesler. You need to unmute.
I'll be right there.
I think Morty's going to help you unmute. There you go.
As I've been listening and I've been taking notes and whatnot, how do we know that Ruth? She was a Moabite, but she could not convert to Judaism back in those days. But could she have felt more connected to Judaism living in a Jewish home? Because she doesn't talk about gods. She talks about my God or your God. And then something else that we just read. Has that ever been looked at?
Yeah, I mean, look, here's what I might say about this, and in a way that I hope makes some sense. The fact that there was not conversion doesn't mean that people didn't join the people. It just means there was no conversion that formalized that. I mean, it's quite possible that people did feel exactly what you're describing.
Maybe she felt that way, and all of this conjecture is just conjecture. I mean, we don't know how she taught. She could have said this exact same thing that she said to Naomi, to her husband, that she was going to follow his people and his religion and his God.
Well, that could be, but nevertheless, the fact that she is risking not having a future in any conventional sense in order to follow this older woman still is what the narrator, I think to a significant degree, wants to call our attention to.
Okay.
That's precisely right. In other words, the fact that she in other words, the wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you sleep, I will sleep. Only death will separate us is still a dramatic statement of love that goes beyond just a religious conversion.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So even if that's it, that's not the entirety of the story, is what I would say.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
That is important. Okay. Yes, it does.
Okay, great. So maybe we have time for maybe one more, if there's anyone who wants to.
Yes, Sherry.
Sherry Israel, is that who that is?
Mm-hmm. You should be able to unmute yourself. There we go.
Yeah, good. Okay.
I don't see you, Sherry, but hi,
I've been
Sherry.
struck for a long time, particularly since this is about generations and the subsequent generations in particular. They were gone 10 years and both the women are childless. And there seems to be no mention of that at all anywhere in the text. And that has always struck me as odd. I wonder
Sorry.
what's that about?
Say more about that, about what you mean by that. I'm not sure I get yet what you're saying.
Ruth and Naomi, and Orpah are both childless after 10 years of marriage.
Right.
That is not a usual
I see.
situation, and particularly in a book which is about the creation of the generations that will lead to David to the kingship.
See, what I have always thought, the way you're asking the question is provocative to me, is interesting. What I have always assumed is that this is a way of making the story like the story of the patriarchs and matriarchs, where the birth of a child is kind of in some way an act of God. It's not just, oh, people have sexual relations, get pregnant, have a baby. There's a divine intervention involved. And that's what's important here, that the baby Ruth will be a baby that God is the one who's responsible for. That's the work that the 10 years of childlessness does. It brings this story, as it were, into the penumbra of the patriarchs and the matriarchs. Does that make some sense?
Yes.
That's my best and frankly my only reading of what that does here, the work that does. I do think again that it's really interesting to think of Ruth as a successor to Abraham. You know, the if I may use a term somewhat colloquially, the gender bending that suggests is really interesting. But the gender bending begins with Rivka,
Yes.
who, you know, is asked, "Will you take this journey?" and says, "Yes, I will." And Rivka becomes the heir of Abraham there, and here Ruth becomes the heir of Rebecca. There's something really interesting going on there, and here God is not remembering. The reason I say that here is God is not remembering here the prayers of, responding to the prayers of a man, but rather to the prayers and needs of a woman.
Okay, so their long childlessness is a necessary foundation for our understanding what this story's about.
I think so. It amplifies the theological frame, as well as the status of Ruth as essentially an heir to the matriarchs and patriarchs.
Okay, thanks.
Notice I'm not saying an heir to the matriarchs. I think it's interesting. It's an heir to the matriarchs and the patriarchs, because that very dichotomy is occluded here, if that makes some sense.
Thanks.
There's a wonderful moment, which we'll talk about briefly next time. The midrash imagines Boaz saying to Ruth, "You are not going to be among the amahot, but among the imahot. You will not be one of the maidens, you will be one of the mothers." So as always, Chazal see what we're seeing, I think. Okay, it's 6:15 exactly, so why don't we call it a day? We will resume tomorrow. I'm not quite sure how we're going to finish this book. I need 5 sessions, it's feeling like, to do this, but we'll see. Thank you all very much. I hope to see you tomorrow, and have a very good and peaceful evening.
Thank you.